Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's my pleasure to welcome you here on this great day at Start King School for the Ministry. My name is Gabriella Lettini, as all of you know. I'm the dean here at Start King, and it's my pleasure to introduce you our guest today, that is the Reverend Dr. Claire MacDonald. And I'll give you a brief introduction and to Dr. MacDonald, and I also asked her to wave in more information about her very interesting professional life throughout her speech. This is the second visit that we have from can I call you Claire?
Of course.
From Claire, that she's a Unitarian minister and writer with a background in performance, actually 30 years of work in theater, who is committed to what she calls writing beyond belief, working in social change and our context to explore new ways of doing, being, and meaning through conversation and collective practice. She writes across cultures and genres, and among other topics, she has written about collaboration, conversation, conviviality, translation, experimental writing, and feminist art. She's a founding editor of the journal Perform and Research, and a recent book of theater text, Utopia, was published by Intellectual Books in 2015. I just saw a copy, and Claire, as she will tell you, she's donating some of her publications to the schools, and she got them here, so I'm very excited, and I get a right of first read. That's because I'm also Claire. As an activist for change, she's committed to the idea, to quote the composer John Luther Adams, that change originates in culture and not in politics, and that art, like religion, operates at the moving edge of experience, always edging into what is just beyond what we think we know. The title of Claire's talk today is Art, Performance, and the Sacred in Ministry. When Claire joined us in the past, she was finishing her training as a Unitarian minister at Manchester College. She is now working as a minister in London, and we'll hear more about that. Both last night, this morning, and the last time we met, we had a wonderful conversation about the interconnection of spirituality, social change, theater, and I feel like that we are very blessed to have this connection and develop this relationship and to hear from you today. So thank you for being here. And before I let you start, I invite all of us to light the chalice together with the traditional Start King chalice lighting that I introduced to Claire a moment ago. You were speaking last night of the importance of having rituals that keep the community together, and I was speaking about the importance of this chalice lighting in our classrooms and different moments of the life of the community. So I think it's good that we'll do it together. With the beginning of this flame, we reaffirm our commitment to accept life's gifts with grace and gratitude, and to use them to bless the world in the spirit of love. Thank you, and thank you, Claire.
Oh, thank you, and what a beautiful way to start. So this morning, yes, I'm so pleased to be here for my second visit here, and the last visit I had already developed these organic connections with Devorah and Sofia, so, and I feel they're my friends from Oxford, which we might well talk about later. And as I talk, and I'm not going to use anything visual today, I'm just going to talk to you really. I just would like to invite you to note things that you want us to talk about, because I'm sure that we could just as easily run the session by you all asking me a question, because I come from afar today and I bring all kinds of possible conversation points from other places. So part of my task today, my purpose today, is to have a conversation with all of you. But I want to begin with a few things that might help us to generate that conversation. And I'm going to begin with a poem, as I often do at the beginning of services. And it's a poem that has been with me, really, in my head and my heart for a couple of years, by a poet who will be familiar to all of us in California, Gary Snyder. For the children. The rising hills, the hopes of statistics lie before us. The steep climb of everything, going up, up, as we all go down. In the next century, or the one beyond that, they say, are valleys, pastures. We can meet there in peace if we make it. To climb these coming crests, one word to you and your children. Stay together, learn the flowers, go light. I want to say amen after that extraordinary poem as well, but something about that will come into what I'm saying. I am a Unitarian minister now, as Gabriella has said, and I also lived in the United States for 7 years, between 1998 and 2005. And it was here that I really reconnected with my own spiritual and religious background, which was in Congregationalism early on. And I have an arts background, I'm a yoga teacher, and I've always been involved in campaigning, in cooperativism, feminism, and I've increasingly written about that in my career as well. A turning point for me in becoming a Unitarian minister was when I did a lay preaching course in 2013. And the Reverend Liz Bertels, who is a long-standing Unitarian minister in Britain, suggested to us that what was very important in ministry was actually to get ourselves out of the way, which sounded quite zen to me in so many ways, and to become a medium, to be in a room in a way that allows the energies there to become more than the sum of their parts, to allow something else to come through. Allowing something else to come through is what I call allowing the more. And I'll talk about what I mean by that more as I speak today. So today this talk is about what that mediumship and that connection means. Conversation and community, and also what the values are that we hold, that we cherish, and that we're willing to stand for. And in saying that, I understand, great word, that stand is a metaphor for commitment. And in the context of the movements and institutions and traditions that combine in worldwide liberal religion, I want to think about value. Making my way up here to Star King is a commitment to ongoing conversation, without a necessary outcome, but understanding in that wonderful phrase of Rebecca Solnit's, that you don't know what you do does. You do what you do the work of faith. We step out into the unknown, we have a glimpse of what lies beyond, and we have the faith that something will come from that. I didn't think that when I imagined coming here to Star King once again, that I would be invoking the Queen. She is, after all, almost 93 and has no constitutional power. She is expected, as you may know, to keep entirely away from UK politics. Although the public have been starting to suspect that she is what we call in Britain a Remainer, opposed to cutting our ties with the European Union, which, as you all know, is destined to happen on March 29th. Right now, the country is in deadlock, shocking, painful, unpleasant divisions and behaviours. And so last week, the Queen made an unprecedented statement. She stepped in, and although it might seem very small, it was in fact very big. And as a friend said to me, the speechwriters must have spent a very long time on those short sentences. And what she said was that we must find common ground, and that we should learn to speak well of one another. And it was significant because in this adversarial world in which we all live, to advocate for common ground, rather than in the UK, in the debating tradition where we have to persuade others that we are right, is now a political act in our country as much as yours. It's not only a political act, but it's an act of witness that says, I see that we are driven apart, that we cannot speak to one another anymore, and that has to change. It is a prophetic voice. It says, find common ground, find it, it matters. matters. It touches on what it is that's at stake. To be human, it goes deep. And it meets me where I stand. I'm with her. I believe that we must find common ground. And like her, I suspect it is an article of faith for me. Common ground first, not after the revolution, now. Find common ground. Find common ground. Find common ground. To find common ground, to be present there, to nourish that ground and make it flourish, we need what the theologian and social thinker Ivan Illich called tools for conviviality. Convivial tools are those that help us to live well and not to lay waste to the planet or human culture. And among those tools is conversation, in its old sense of living together. And there I take that sense. I've learned a lot from the ethicist Kwame Anthony Appiah, who's written a lot about conversation. Those teachers, broadly, Appiah and Illich, to me touch on our spiritual commons, our spiritual common ground, what it is that we have access and right to simply by being human, or should, what it is that we need to thrive. In English law, our commons, the right of commoners to the woods in common land, for instance, or that's enshrined in the House of Commons, the land itself, clean water and air, shelter, nourishment, is material. And our spiritual commons also include love and shared access to the meaning and mystery of what it means to be human. All this is our common ground, our shared common ground, our commons. We are, and I don't need to tell you this, in a critical moment ethically, climatically, economically, and spiritually. And if we cannot nourish the spirit, then we're in a debilitating moment politically, culturally, and economically. The New Yorker last week, or the New Yorker last week talked of the derangement that is American life right now. And the Queen, in making a call that has the backing of her 65 years of public service, is very serious indeed. If we're on the moving edge of being, then we fear that edge right now. We fear we're going over it into the abyss. And yet, last year I had Angela Davis speak in London, our common ground, a prophetic voice, a witness. Hopeful she was, she said, in what she sees now. Hope, hopeful times, the most hopeful times that she's seen for years, always. Freedom is a constant struggle, but as she didn't say, but might have said, love will guide us. And I say all of this because in these difficult times, I find myself, as I know you do, at the crossroads of hope and despair. And I find myself at the crossroads of the sacred and the social, more and more aware that what we need in these times is more than. And by that, I mean this. Before I began my ministry training, I went to a conference at the Jesuit college where I did my master's degree, Heathrow College in London. I went to a conference about the Canadian social thinker, Charles Taylor, who was one of the founders of New Left Review, actually, in the late 1950s. And Damien Howard, SJ, who was one of my teachers, asked this question that really stayed with me. He said, what are we doing this for? Are we just building the community centre, or is there more? And of course, he never said what the more was, very Jesuitical. But that question has stayed with me. What is the more? And I've come to think that that is what we are doing. We are finding the more, and we're working in the more, and we are the more. And that the faith that we have is also that there is more. In my jet-lagged state at about 4:30 this morning, I listened to the BBC World Service programme Outlook. And on that was a very long interview, actually, with So that little introduction is part of a way of suggesting that there are themes there that I want to talk about with you and want to share with you. That sense of what conversation is, of how doing these very ordinary things, sitting here, lighting a candle, being together, walking, planting trees, cooking meals, that are those the places where the sacred is inherently present, which are also the spaces of the spirit and which can nourish our future. I began my career working in the arts, and I still do work in the arts. And I still teach theatre. In the last year, I ran a master's degree in playwriting. I tend to do it now when other people are on sabbatical. And last year was very difficult because the university was on strike most of the year as well. But mostly I work in what I call conversation and community. So that I see my call as call to connect. And I see ministry as a thread of continuous connection amongst us, to our values and to the world. And it's a thread that allows a dynamic journey to keep on taking place, one that provokes and embraces the more. And so I'm here today, really, to have a conversation with you in these times about the shared concerns and the interests and the passions that we have. Some of us for Unitarianism, for Unitarian Universalism, but for liberal religion, all of us. And liberal values, although I think that's also something we might want to discuss. And I began with the Queen because those words are also words that touch my values as a Unitarian. That really surprised me. So I want very briefly now to just touch on some of the issues that I think is happening in the denomination which ordained me, Unitarianism. In Britain, it's Unitarian and Free Christian, in the UK. And to think about how it's changing and what it's responding to. And last night, Gabriella and I began to have a conversation about something which is very much part of the culture at the moment, which is that the way in which we do things, just by being here, just by lighting a candle, just by sitting in a circle, just by committing ourselves to process without outcome, that we're already modeling the kind of way in which we want to be as a culture. And I see that certainly in the UK, and I'm sure it's true in the United States as well, as very much part of the hunger that people have at the moment for change. So I've become involved, for instance, in something called, it's called XR at the moment, Extinction Rebellion, which was started by scientists just a few months ago and has really gathered spirit, I would say, spiritual energy, which is about climate emergency. And at Extinction Rebellion gathering, the first one I went to, was a big demonstration where people took over the bridges across the river in London and stopped the traffic, but very kindly. So saying, I'm terribly sorry, it won't be very long, but we're just doing this because you know, humanity's about to end. And then and then we all walked to Parliament Square, and for some reason they just re-turfed it. Mostly there was so much protest going on outside Parliament, and it was dusk, and we all knelt, thousands of us. And somebody rang a bell, and somebody sang a song. And what was so surprising about it really was that there was just a very surprising in the UK, an absolutely authentic and unashamed in any way spirituality present in that crowd. And the kinds of things that we do in liberal religious circles, and I'm only saying that because they're not connected necessarily to the liturgical practice or the story that takes place within Christian churches or the liturgy of other religions either. But the things that we do, beginning our sessions by breathing in, by reflecting, by closing our eyes, by reading, all of these things are happening as Extinction Rebellion. Because people are very, very aware that if we don't have spiritual nourishment, we won't have food for the journey. We will not be able to make it, if you like. And I want to talk about ways in which that may be very relevant now to liberal religion in my country and to the core of Unitarianism, to stand on the side of love, to become connectors and mediums and keepers of peace. So that's one really important thing, that there's a popular popular spirituality arising again, of course, in campaigning, and particularly in campaigning for the earth. This is also happening in singing. So I just joined a choir called the Fire Choir, which is about, started by a young folk singer called Sandy. And it's lots and lots of people joining it, which is about singing songs for campaigns. We have great songs for campaigns in Materialism, and they're not just, they're political songs from Brazil, they're political songs obviously of South America is a very big source of those political songs, but they're also songs of the spirit as well. We began by singing around a song which is about love and compassion and our need for the love and compassion for one another. At the same time, I live in a country in which anything church is definitely seen by people, particularly by white people who've grown up in the British education system, who've got some kind of Christian background, as establishment. So the idea of liberal theologies, of radical theologies, is not nearly as present as it is, for instance, in this country, for instance. It's not so present in the world of people who come from other places, who are immigrants, or Catholics from Eastern Europe, if they're Christians. It's not present in the same way for people of African descent or people of Caribbean descent. But it's a very important part of British culture. So thinking about this spirituality and where it meets old stories and the older practices of established religion is very important too. There's a huge need for belonging at the moment. There's just a huge need for belonging. Our government, as yours in state, I'm thinking here of state governments and state legislators and citywide legislatures as well, a huge amount of research being done into loneliness, into the fact that communities are becoming fractured, and more people living on their own. So that huge hunger to belong is something that I feel is very, very important to discuss in terms of where we are in religious denominations as well. And there's a need to revoke and recharge the economic structure of capitalism. That's, and that's become something which is now said very, very widely, not just by people who were once on the far left, but that sense that we have moved into a situation of vast inequality is also something we're all feeling that we really need to address. We have in our country also a real need, and it's come up today and it came up last night as well, for really understanding what I call ministry beyond congregation. I mean, I'm a great believer, of course, and practitioner of a shared ministry, and priesthood of all believers, a real feeling that ministry is what we share, what we do. Those of us who are called to ministry are called to make connections rather than necessarily being top-down leaders anymore, but we're proponents of what Charles Ledbetter, an entrepreneur, called the culture of and with rather than culture of to and from. And that involves us also thinking about things like whether our liturgies, what place our liturgies have, and whether they need to also change as well. These are the questions, I think, that are beginning to inform what happens within liberal religion in the UK, I think, and they may meet some of you where you sit, where you practice as well. But we clearly, one of my big concerns at the moment is how we face into the world, how we operate in the world, how we make connections, how we re-enchant and reinvigorate a sense of spiritual community. So what's happening there in Unitarianism, which obviously I'm committed to because I'm a minister in the denomination, which means that I think I can be a critical friend to it, by the way, and not just that I've drunk the Kool-Aid, no Kool-Aid to drink, but you know what I mean. There are several things happening that I think are very, very interesting and important in my small world, or the little coffee shop of Unitarianism where I kind of come from, and bigger things too. So we are a very, very, as Meg particularly knows, because she also PhD in Britain and knows the scene over the years there. We're a very small denomination, but we're not the only liberals on the block. Christianity in itself, where we came from, is changing enormously and is up for reclamation and reinvigoration, of course. And in Britain, there's, as here I'm sure, the really, really big thing is the interconnected work across faiths, really enormous. And that's can be very difficult for Unitarians, and again, we talked about it last night, because actually traditionally Unitarians in many ways have been outside the Christian embrace, if you like, so not in the World Council of Churches and not in something called Churches Together, but are at the table with other faiths too. And that's become the most important thing, the table where all faiths can sit and all faiths can share. That's very, very significant. We're tiny, yes, but we have a new CEO, and she's been here. I don't know if you know this. You do know this.
It's a symposium.
Fantastic. So Liz Slade, who's a friend of mine as well, became a friend of mine through Unitarianism, was the CEO of something called Sunday Assembly, which has also made its way across this side of the Atlantic, which is a kind of really non-religious church where they sing pop songs and kind of do stuff on Sundays without all the other things that churches do, like gospel kind of stuff. But anyway, but Liz is a Unitarian, and Liz is now been made CEO. She has a background in science and health, and so she's very, very interested in making the kinds of connections and the kind of outreach that I think I would really like to talk about to you. That's very, very important. At the same time, because we're a very, very small denomination, we have also had to radically rethink what ministry education means. And I know as well that that's also something to think about, what it means to educate ministers and how. And, you know, that's been very historically informed in Unitarianism in Britain. So it's taken place in two colleges, a Northern College at Martin Luther King House in Manchester, and in the south in Oxford at Manchester College, Oxford. That's now been changed, and we've set up something which is much more like something called the Open University in Britain, which began as something called University of the Air. The idea, in fact, that you can have a kind of, as you have here, a kind of a low residency and self-directed form of education, which is experimental at the moment, and which has got really only about, it's got 3 people this year who began that individual journey, all very, very interesting, very good people. And at the same time, there's still a little bit left at Harris Manchester College. Harris Manchester College, as Sofia and Devorah knows, and Meg knows very well, an extraordinary resource. Now have a wonderful new head of college called Jane Shaw, who I think is a friend of Stocking as well. So there's all kinds of tantalizing new possibilities for making, for reconnection and really making change. So on that kind of level, the level of what this might be as a social movement and an organisation is really up for change. That's fantastic. So that's 2 things. Liz Slade becoming the CEO and the education model changing. So I'd really like to talk about that with you. One of the other things that I'm really interested in, and I'll tell you a little bit about it, is that I've worked for the past 4 or 5 years voluntarily at one of the only mission churches as the domestic mission that Unitarianism set up in the 19th century. And that is a huge church in Bethnal Green in East London. And it was a 19th century mission church at a time when this was a very, very poor part of London, still is. And there were many settlement houses there. Some of them were attached to Oxford colleges, they were attached to Anglican Church. Some of them were very radical and attached to sort of radical social movements. And there was a Catholic ones there as well. So it's a very, very interesting religious history. And what's now called the Garrett Centre, the church is actually named now, the centre is named for a social reformer called Elizabeth Jacqueline Garrett. Became a conventional congregation at some point, then lost its congregation and then was empty. And last year, a radical arts organisation that I've worked with for many years, we negotiated for 2 years for them to took a very, very long time, but they came in and occupied the entire worship space. Actually, I can show you that, actually, and find a way to show you later what that looks like. So the Live Art Development Agency came in there, and very, very queer focused, very radical, very experimental arts organisation came in there upstairs. We were already inhabiting the downstairs space with a wonderful social action project called Simple Gifts, which is about food, poverty, children's after school clubs, story sharing, really across many kinds of communities. And the concern was from the trust and from other people who were holding this space was that these things could not work together. But in fact, what we realised is they really can work together. And the kinds of convivial tools that the Live Art Development Agency generated, and their director, who was totally atheist and absolutely anti-religious, has of course discovered that her great aunt was a Unitarian. But also, they have absolutely embraced the shared values that we have of freedom and tolerance, of reason, but also of real community and spiritual change. And so the kinds of things that they are now doing, they appointed me as a thinker in residence, which is to make connections between the areas that I've talked about. And they are making, I just had an email last night with 21 applications to create new kinds of connected community art projects for the building itself, to inhabit the building. It could be sound projects or garden projects, poetry projects. The kinds of things that they're doing really help me to see ways in which we can also develop those kinds of tools ourselves in congregational and beyond congregational situations. So that whole notion of, and to me that connects with this conversation I'd like to have with you. What does it mean to be a minister? What does it mean to minister? What does it mean to go out into community now? Finally, I want to say one other pointer, if you like, to something I think can be very interestingly internationally shared as well. We have several things in British Unitarianism that are very, very independent. So this is one, as Garrett Centre, but another one is the summer school, Unitarian Summer School, which I don't know if anybody here has ever been to or heard of. So we have a retreat centre in the Peak District called the Nightingale Centre. It's named for Florence Nightingale. It's a lovely place and a wonderful part of the country. And the summer school that has developed there is one of those community living, week-long community living experiences and events, which very much is about this notion of how we model, how we would like to be and live and learn together. This year it's on embodied theology, the whole notion of how we experience in comfort and discomfort, in many ways, religion and spirituality through the body. And it's really, really, last year it was on death, which was equally interesting, living and dying. But it's also developing a way of learning together, and it's very much open for connection as well. So something that I'd very much like to talk about and share with you. So I want to kind of enter into the conversation there, really, with you, if that's okay, and kind of open up around some of those areas that we can just spend a little bit of time really talking about that, and then you can really ask me questions. I just want to end here by going back to something which comes up time and time again, and which Gabriella mentioned to me last night, which was Standing Rock. So the quotation from Rebecca Solnit that I used earlier on, "You don't know what you do does," was written by her in relationship to the witness at Standing Rock, that whatever happens, when you faithfully take on that commitment, something will come from it. It may not happen now. You don't know what you do does. And we know as well that the value of deeply rooted spirituality on which that witness was based is nourishing, that it allows communities to go beyond themselves. And so that our notion of being here now is also to be present to those who come before us. And that's something I really want to work at and be aware of. It was Mikhail Bakhtin who said that communism had no care for the dead. If anyone knows that, he could not be a communist because communism had no care for the dead. It had no conviviality with the dead who are still present with us in whatever way. But we might also say that the problem with capitalism is that it has no care for the future. What we do know is that we still have a present and that there's no one else here, just us. And our call is to act here now. So the question is that I leave with really is how to live next and what we're called to do. And I'd like to leave that there and then open up the questions with you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Breathe in and breathe out. I'm just going to say one more thing, which is I brought today some books today to the library. Kind of a nice segue, perhaps, into what we might discuss. So one of them is a book of plays of mine called Utopia, which is kind of self-evident, really. They're three plays to do with two people, a man and a woman, thinking about creating and destroying worlds. This performance project I've just been involved in, To You, Love Letters to a Post-Europe, which began in Athens about 3 years ago. And it was very much to do with artists making, again, embodied responses with love to this crisis of Europe that we're in. I write about collaboration as well, and so this Histories and Practices of Live Art I have an essay in here which is partly to do with kind of reflecting on what collaboration in the arts has been, and partly as a social phenomenon and how important it's been in generating new kinds of art. And then I'm leaving this, which is an essay on play and violence, which is related to the work of an Israeli artist who works on play and conflict. So I'm leaving all those, I'm naming them, but I'm leaving all those here for the library here as well. So, where shall we begin? Should we do a little check-in, actually?
I have an interest that is probably much more mine than the group's.
Yeah.
That is that when you talked about educating ministers and you brought up setting up more open university, low residency, self-directed form of education. That, of course, is, as people here know, what I'm really interested in, and noticing how it has changed our school's culture, how it has changed the formation process of Unitarian Universalist ministers in the U.S. And you brought up then the retreat center, Nightingale, and wondering if those two, if you've put those two together for bringing low residency students together in summer school. And I would just like to know everything that you're doing about this new, where three people are involved. It could be a private conversation.
Yeah, I'm interested in that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, yeah.
You don't have to. I think all right. Okay. Thank you, Matthew.
Well, let's keep that in the space, really. It's a big question, and it touches on very many things about what we think that religious education is doing as a transformative convivial tool as well, and what it draws on. So, yeah, I think, and it also draws, perhaps, I think what I've also heard, it touches on some of the anxieties as well about ministry. So it's also about what do we do when we don't have money? How do we recharge a dying denomination? In other words, there are many colours, if you like, to this weave that's becoming a new kind of ministry.
Oh, well, I just came from a whole weekend in Portland where I was pushing one of our more, in my opinion, they may not agree with me, but one of our more conservative EU congregations, to think about leaning our liberal tradition into deliberation, into liberation. And so I was really curious and interested to hear you talking about this, what I would call responsibility to the ancestors, but this reaching to the ancestors in our traditions. And I want to admit that I always get suspicious when people ask us for conviviality, or even when protests are polite. You know, I wonder, and part of that's cultural. I know we are coming from different lived realities.
Yeah.
And you know, I would love a theological conference called, you know, I'm so sorry, but the human race is dying. Like that place of what, you know, what does that ask of us? And so when I think about ministry these days, I'm trying to get our members with incredibly different lived experiences of our liberal tradition, and whether or not its freedoms have ever included us or our ancestors. To me, there's this deep spiritual work of lamentation and restoration and remediation that predates, not predates, that for me must come before conviviality. It must. And so the question I'm always left with is, how do we, as faith leaders, sit in the intersection of the many and varied lived realities that our people's ancestors carried, to encourage what I think can almost only happen in our religious communities, which are those rituals from a wide variety of locations that might actually bring us to a shared place. But I feel like I'm still hearing the same minds driving our thinking. And I think we're going to leave out 80% of humanity and the entire rest of the world that is not human in an attempt, right, in an attempt at restoration that I don't think is possible with only a very small set of us. But actually, I loved that you talked about our liberal Unitarian tradition and ancestry. Usually when people use that language, they just mean, you know, the white man whose theology we still repeat. And I didn't feel that from you. And so I would love to hear some of how you think we can minister with that ancestral knowing in these times. Yeah. I know that's not a small question, I'm sorry, but I've been talking for like 10 hours this weekend. That's where my brain is.
Should we go around as we do that? Because that's such very big and wonderfully rich and very, very, very important aspects. We'll come back, yeah. Thank you so much.
With Devorah, I'm thinking a lot about shifts in the way that we are together in this changing dynamic, and as you're exploring this way of training ministers, and as we have increasing percentage of students who are not moving here or from here when they start school, and even if they move here, they're working jobs or they live 15 miles from the school. It's a very different experience from, I think, most of the rest of us in this room when we went to seminary, what it looked like. And so there's a very natural conviviality that occurs when you are there in person together. And you can have those formative conversations that aren't part of the class, right? Because they happen in the hallway or they happen in your apartment when you're, as we did, we stuck Post-it notes to a dartboard, and that's how we studied for our exams, theology darts. But so those very tangible, embodied, practices are fading. So we have this, it's an interesting juxtaposition, being open to what digital technology can provide in terms of bringing a person together across the country, and yet there is a disembodiment to that.
Yeah.
So it's just, it's an interesting challenge to reclaim, like, how you feel yourself in the body and the theology and spirituality as an embodied being looks like when our connections to one another are becoming increasingly ephemeral.
Yeah.
So that's a tough needle to thread, but we're working with that right now. I'm not sure where we're going, but we know we need to go somewhere.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. That's, yeah.
You pass. Should we go to Sarah?
Well, you want to introduce it, or you already introduced it?
Sarah,
Sarah?
hi.
Hi. Hi. Oh, okay, now maybe you can see me. Hi. So glad to be here in my, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. Sorry, I may have missed the prompt. Are we just kind of checking in with what questions we have? Sure, yeah, and that's kind of where my question is. Let's see. So I come from a performance background myself, and I'm really passionate about the embodiment that can bring, that the arts can bring to these questions and these conversations, in particular, matters of social change and a spirituality that extends beyond establishment. I'm a late millennial, and so I'm of that generation that is drifting farther from these established places of religion myself. So, but I have found that always in the arts for me. That's where I've found that connection. So I'm curious to know what modalities or recommendations or thoughts you have about the role that performance plays in these conversations. I know you mentioned some of the programs that you have advised on or currently advise on, but I'd be curious to know if there are, I've had some experience with theater of the oppressed and other applied theater, and that's where my work is now, but I'm hungry for more examples of ways to bring that embodied conversation to a world that, not just in our higher education, but, all of our, I loved Chris's question that so many of our interactions are kind of disembodied these days. And I know that there is that hunger to belong that you speak of, and that hunger for something tangible and felt. So that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, that conversation across those, yeah, I think that's that question about what the arts bring. I'll say something about that. That's, yeah. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Should we just go on checking in, and then we'll kind of do perfect.
Oh,
Here we go.
and thank you so much for being here with us. Gosh, there's so many different areas that I was struggling with. You were talking about 3 people going to seminary, and I know that even here in the States, we have over 100 of us that come to Star King. I'm both a student and I work in admissions, so I get to oddly see dual roles of being at Star King. And I think often we struggle even coming together with the fact that while there's 100 of us or more, it still feels so small. And then like we come together for a week and then we go home. And so I think oftentimes even in our formation, we feel disconnected from each other, even when we're wholly present with each other. And so I'm curious, for one, about building connections with the people in England, because I think it would be really important for both us here at Star King and for them to see that there is a shared vision, and that we all are trying to do similar things. I think we can definitely build its strongest together. Also, I really appreciated you bringing up ancestral information. I took a course last week on really a huge part of it had to do with healing of the ancestors.
Yeah.
And I think that personally, I can't speak for anybody else, that we often try to hide who we come from, whether it's in our personal lives or in our faith traditions. We don't want to admit what has happened, and I think that that's really important in both aspects to understand really who we are as people and as a faith in order to move forward. It helps you see the line of where you're headed to know where you're coming from. And so I would love to hear more about that as well.
Yes, that's really resonating amongst us, isn't it? That question of past and present, the ancestors and connection. Yeah, I think I've forgotten your name.
Matthew, sorry.
Yeah, okay, Matthew. Really do.
Yeah.
Oh, one quick thing I wanted to just throw in the group as an answer to this thread of conversation about disembodiment is that I actually, when I studied for my first degree in theology in Italy, where I was one of a few women in the whole program, I had no women faculty, etc. That was in many ways, my body was on work. And so that there is I just wanted to throw in there that just to be in an area residency model, etc., doesn't give you a liberated embodied experience. It's all about what bodies are really important in a context, and so that thread should be important. It's also as we connect to this whole other question of like we are changing modalities, and so what do we bring to that in terms of justice question and whose bodies are central and whose bodies can be be flourishing in a thrive in a context should be really important, because it doesn't just happen because we show up nowhere or not. The other thing that as part of the conversation, there were so many threads. We have talked a lot already, and we'll do it more tonight. But one of the thread for one of the many threads is about what as we do justice work in a way that is intersectional, that acknowledges what Sofia was bringing up, the fact that we do come from differences, and these are all this grieving and this trauma and historical layers of trauma that need to be acknowledged. What are transformative practices and education, and the fact that your background, I was telling her things that I learned after like 20 years of teaching about what to do or not to do in the classrooms in relation to that, and I was speaking about some of the practices I use in the eco course, and Sarah was just in my eco course, and she was like, and you were saying, oh, I do that, I always do that in theater, I always did that in theater class, and I was like, wow, which I always knew there are so many interconnections between obviously liturgy and okay. But it's also how, like, there's so many interesting conversations to be had about pedagogy and transforming the academy of learning from different fields who have done different things. So like hearing more from you about
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm Meg Richardson, and when I was at Paris, it was Manchester College.
So Paris.
And Ralph Waller was the principal, and now my good friend from Harvard Divinity School, Jane Shaw, is the principal, and so excited about that. And then when I was there, one of my best friends was Alex Bradley, who
oh my God,
I know, and Liz Bertels.
Oh, Liz
So this is like, I'm in a huge place of nostalgia. And then the other thing is the class that you visited last year, the history of UU prophetic witness, is moving to an online class. So I've been fiddling with it. And what I'm doing with it is we're going to be doing videos. And I found that the only way it really works for them to do a short presentation of 10 minutes is I have to make a video to introduce it, and then I can restrict them, because otherwise they have up to 60 minutes, and that's not going to work for anyone. So, so I've been learning how to do it, but the thing is, I don't really like making videos, and so I'm kind of figuring out ways to do it where I'm not just horrified to see my face every time I pull up the online shell.
Yeah.
So, because it seems to freeze you when you're frowning and you've got your eyes closed and your mouth open. So, the fish thing that Sophia's talked about before. So, so anyhow, that's one thing. And then the other thing that I was listening to was that when we go back in our ancestors for the 19th century, the first third of the 19th century, we've got the transcendentalist women using conversation as a transformative religious ritual.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important that we reclaim that.
Yes. I think that was part of, yeah, we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Shannon.
Oh, Lord. There are many things that are very live for me as I, Sarah, see where I sit.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, so
Next
it's
thing
not
I see.
you. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. Hi, it's good to see you. Yeah, many things are live for me. This piece about trauma around embodiment and that how dynamic and shifting that is, and incredibly multifaceted. I find myself interpreting so much of what I'm taking in right now through this, through many lenses, but at the moment, how it relates to organizational culture, because that's where I find myself. And as I mentioned to you earlier this morning, really do feel as though my staff position here is a ministry.
We'd agree.
I forget that often. We some of us talk a lot about culture change and what that looks like in the Star King context specifically. So I'm curious about how to incorporate, challenge, play with, have curiosity around some of what you're sharing as it relates to, Dr. Latini is talking about transformative practices in teaching, and I'm thinking about transformative practices in organizational culture and development, and as an individual, as a collective, and that celebrating what is currently life-giving and working well, and the wisdom and expertise of the beings in the space, and where we can work and advocate for evolution and growth, and how we can push and challenge one another to that. So that's sort of what I'm holding and wrestling with right now.
Thank you. I'm so struck by being here, by the thought that we couldn't be having this conversation in any other context than a spiritual and religious one at the moment. And so what that says to me is that that space in itself is able to host things. It's a cultural space. And I'm very interested in organizational culture as well. And I think that at different times, different places in the culture can hold these kinds of conversations that we need to have again and again, thinking about where the past and future come together, of how we change, of how we collaborate, of how we create the kinds of lives we want to live. And I don't really have an answer to that, but I'm very fascinated by the fact that that's what's happened in religion. That it's become a space where we can rethink how to be and how we relate to one another. That is interesting. There's so many spaces, certainly in my own culture, which are so over-capitalized and so monetized and so, so kind of overlooked. But this space isn't always. So here we are, and this is very familiar as an arts space. It is like being in a theatre environment. And I mean, I would say in the performance environment, the thing that I didn't say but could have said is that to anybody who's been in certainly in a theatre background, and if I say come from a theatre background, people who, you know, very understandably go to see things as a patron or consumer will think that it's that you've learned how to speak in public, and of course you have. But the real thing about theatre, as everybody who's involved in it knows, is the process of going through it. So it's the rehearsal room, and it's the fact that you go through an absolutely transformative personal journey in that room. And a friend of mine who's a director always says that the only good thing about theatre is the first 10 minutes in the bar afterwards. The rest of it is, you know, and what he meant really was it's so separate from this extraordinarily transformative process. And in theatre teaching, certainly in the UK, and I've taught theatre in America as well, but it became a long time ago, it became an experimental space for being together with one another and making things. And so having a covenant at the beginning of a process or class is always the case. And then looking at how we might deal with the challenges, for instance, of being in a room with nothing but ourselves, and what we might make here, and how we might produce something at the end of that. So I think it's very transformative. I think that's the essence of what makes these two things come together for me. I don't know if that speaks to you, Shannon, or to you, Sarah, that the sense that it is it's already a transformative kind of process, and it has the other thing is certainly I think it's probably true in the United States, there's less division here, but in Britain there was traditionally a very, very, very clear division between head and heart, or between head and technical or embodied education. So whatever you're doing, whether you're actually a car mechanic or a musician, that form of education in which the knowledge is learned through the body is very separated from the knowledge in which your kind of intellectual education. So the notion that we also occupy a space spiritually in which we're trying to bring together what it means to have a learning that's more embodied seems to me to be really, really important. I don't know if that touches.
Do you spend time talking about covenant now in the UK? Because I know when I was there, you didn't at all.
Well, you know, I mean, the thing is, the United States is a covenantal culture, so the word in itself goes so deeply back into what it means to be in it, you know, with all of the complexities and fractures that has. It is still a covenantal culture. People understand that's part of the kind of DNA of the state.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely not the case
Right.
in a culture which has a parliamentary system and doesn't bring people together under those conditions. But it is beginning to be talked about. And certainly in my background in theatre education, if we didn't call it a covenant, it would always be a kind of contract, which isn't just about a kind of, which has an element of spirituality in it. We are talking more about covenant.
I was thinking you might be, because we're talking so much more about it now
Are you?
than when I was in, I
Yeah.
did my theological education 85 to 88,
Yeah.
and it really was just a polity thing then. And
Yes,
now
it
it's really kind of, it kind of boggles my mind sometimes, because a covenant can be a very slender thing. And we're asking it to do a lot of heavy lifting in the UUA. And so, so I was kind of curious about how that was playing out for you.
Well, there's probably a covenant project there, it's really seriously, because that sense of what we're asking it to do, what it can hold, what it can't hold, what different organisational agreements we now want to come to, and how we might work with that more widely, feels really important. Sorry, Chris, I was looking back.
Oh, you can go first.
Well, and in this conversation, for me, it always goes back to Sophia's question.
Yeah.
Because covenant, it depends who does the covenant and what are the assumptions of the covenant and who is involved. So I always try to teach my students, don't jump in with this idea that the covenant is the same one, because your ideas of covenant might be so oppressive to a whole bunch of other people. So it depends how you do it. So it goes back to that question. Now that Sofia raised, I would like to hear more about what is happening for you in the work.
I was just curious, what is the weight-bearing hopes for covenant for UUs these days? Because it's interesting, I have a shared Baptist UU background and separatism and the role of covenants, and covenants historically have a strong role in Baptist congregations, and there have been efforts to kind of revive covenantalism and the practice of congregational covenants, and so I know that conversation among Baptists. I guess I'm curious, what is the load-bearing hope for covenant then in UU terms?
Probably Sophia has the most expertise in this.
Well, I just think that this is why I think multi-religiosity is so important, right? If we sit with our Jewish kin, there's nothing larger than covenant. And I think that part of the trouble is that we have an anemic understanding of covenant.
Yeah.
And when I'm in justice-oriented circles, in non-dominant cultural spaces, in Unitarian Universalism is having a covenantal theology. And I think that, so I don't know, I was a student here starting in '98, and you could not get into a class without the entire first process being deeply co-constructed covenant. And
Wow.
we can stand to return to
In a
more of
decade.
that. Yeah. But I also think that I think we need to stop allowing ourselves to sanitize our history, because a covenant is meaningless to me if you don't know how very far you're asking me to trust you based on what has been. And what I get from a lot of UUs is, don't you know that it's urgent? You have to trust me. And I'm like, never again. Like, actually, and the hard thing, I'm sorry, let me be really honest that you're hearing me after 900 older white UUs have been pushing back against liberation with me for a weekend. So I can hear that my language is more strident than it would normally be. And I'm sorry, it's because I haven't really had a pause from that. But that challenge of, if there is this urgency, if we are saying that faith holds a space that very little else is holding right now, in these moments when I think the more apparent the failings of our systems, the more anxious more of us become. I don't think it's actually worse. I just think more of us are more anxious than we were. But we have to be those who can hold the real stories long enough to change what that coming together even means. And so I want a robust, ritualized covenantal theology. I think that it's really necessary, but we are and I really fear that we're still holding, but our sanctuary is named after this person. Great, that person said some great things. I also need you to know that, like, he didn't mean most of them. And that is okay. We're still fully human. Let's own our story so we can start to tell a new one. And we have a lot of fear of losing each other when we start telling the truth about our history. And that's why I want, how do we as pastors hold that fear space so that there might actually be ground for real covenant? And I don't feel like I have a perfect answer to that. I have this awareness that we aren't speaking full conversations. The silenced part of our dialogue is immense, and I think where the work actually needs to be centered. And actually, to me, that is why we need art and theater, right? That sometimes there are modes that can communicate what we almost cannot bear to share in our more common modes of communicating with each other.
Sure, we should respond to that, Sophia. Should I say something?
I would love to hear what you would have to say about that.
Oh,
Yeah,
I find that there's so, this question really makes me think about what's at stake, and that question of the floor and the ceiling is so important, that the notion that this is absolutely you have to have some grounding, even when that grounding is moving under your feet. So I like your earlier point about politeness, that we have to, plenty of people whose call is not to be polite, but to shout, or to do things that we find completely almost unacceptable. In other words, if these are urgent times, then how do we embrace a very authentic range of behavior, that we're not expecting people to be polite, we're not expecting them to behave in prescriptive ways. I think that's one of the really important things. The other thing I want to say is something about conviviality, because we've kind of got lost with it a little bit. I want to say something about it, which is, I think it's really different if covenant is a verb, if you like, and if conviviality is a question. Because I don't think that Ivan Illich was talking about middle class being nice, being nice. Because he had some very, very difficult.
And I haven't read his work, so he
had some very, very difficult engagement with, I was saying to Gabrielle last night, when he was a Jesuit. And he had some very, he read his school in society, for goodness sake, it was really, he was very much on the side of the poor and the marginalised, the oppressed. But I think that notion of conviviality is not about trying to be nice to one another, but how to generate tools, that enable co-living, that enable us to live. And so that, to me, that's how I read it, is the what's at stake in what it takes to live. And I think these new movements, from Occupy and all kinds of other things onward, they're embodying that question. And the ancestors is just, again, that's such a, I've always, you kind of raised new things for me about that extraordinary Bakhtin quote, from the middle of communist Russia. Communism has no care for the dead. Wow. If societies have no care for the dead, and then what does that mean?
Well, and capitalism, I heard you say, has no care for the future, but capitalism doesn't exist without creating the dead.
Right. Yeah.
And that piece for me is vital.
Yeah. I mean, a way of being quite rhetorical there, like, communism has no care for the dead. Maybe capitalism has no care for the future. Yeah, capitalism, of course, is constantly creating the dead. Is laying waste.
Yes.
Is laying waste, and that's, where are we in Catholics? When I did my master's, the first class we did was about that. How has modernity laid waste to all of the people for whom it just absolutely did not give agency, authority, individuality? And I just find I'm almost breathless already with, the difficulty of thinking that through sometimes. It's a very, very hard one. And and that's very inarticulate, but it's something. Yeah. I also want to say that the one other thing, if I could just add to it, kinship. The sense of, I think it's Kwame Anthony Appiah who talks about elective affinity, which is Goethe, isn't it? That the notion that kinship, standing for, speaking for, being committed to notions of connection and kinship that are not to do with heteronormative kinds of family and but that our kin is also other, feel really an important question.
Claire, we talked about, I don't know if you want to say something, but we had that question about how, last night we were talking, I was asking you how Unitarianism in the UK is engaging with white supremacy and racism as they exist in the UK versus, you know.
I can't even have to give me the context again.
Well, the context was I think we were speaking about what, you know, the commitment Starkin has and parts of the UU movement have to dismantle white supremacy and really engage races and work for racial justice, and also all the challenges that are there. And related to some of the kinds of conversation we just had, and how they exist. We also talked about the fact, though, that while, like in Italy, we engage in some of the same issues, and yeah, there's always context and histories that are different. And so what is specific to each context? I mean, one of the issues of, and I see that often even in our students here, that when people for different reasons don't have the either privilege or lack of privilege to move from where they are, and they have only one frame of reference, which is US society. They think that everywhere issues are happening exactly in the same configuration that happen here. And that is so wrong, and it's so hard to explain them. And so I just wanted to hear more about you. You taught me more about what was the work that you were doing in a more multiracial context, mostly outside Unitarian Church, and the challenges that.
I know I don't want to set myself up in any way as any kind of expert. I mean, I'm a sort of witness to certain things that are happening here. The way that things are very, very different, of course, in the UK, but they're also dependent on the place that you find yourself, on your own social, cultural, racial, class, gender position, and how you see the relationship between Britain and America, actually, in many ways. I mean, one of the most hopeful things that I've seen at the moment is, for me, it's a really, but it's quite troubling, so I'm sharing it in quite a troubling way, is this work beyond congregation in community that's happening in this old mission church in Bethnal Green. Now, that has a historically, it was always a very, very, what we call now multicultural community, because it's always a place where lots of immigrants came, so it was Jewish and Irish Catholic, and then lots of Bengali people came in the 60s, so it's, now there's lots of people from absolutely everywhere, lots of Eastern Europeans as well, lots of Africans. It's one of those places, that kind of hub in London. And what Simple Gift, the Unitarian Social Action Centre, has been able to somehow be is a place where many different people can come together. Things get very sectorized, or they developed, things that come from the state in general are projected towards particular communities. So we're going to do a lunch for older white working class people who remember, what this was like during the war, and we're going to do this. But Simple Gifts has really been very good at bringing people together. What also happened, because we were able to bring in this big, very queer-orientated arts community, was that the presence of many young trans people, which certain people felt might cause huge issues when those people came together with people in, like young Muslim mothers or hijabs and so on, kind of didn't happen. That in fact, those people there are all sorts of ways in which these communities have been able to talk to one another, to share food, cultures, to
and issues, there were common issues.
And common issues. Well, common issues have been how you feel on the street, actually, to do with if you're wearing a hijab and how you feel if you're a young trans person. Funnily enough, those have been important common issues, and they've been very important. And also the same issues are being dealt with by with what's happening to children and what's happening to boys and to girls with gender identification, with violence, with all kinds of things. So actually this kinship, if you like, that's not conventional kinship, has been able to be held there. And I don't think that's just Unitarian at all, but it's just happening in that space. And I think what has happened to the arts organisation, and this is, I was saying to Gabriella, is that they have embraced Unitarian values, because they were asked to in that very conventional way. You know, if you come in here, you're not going to be faith averse, and these are the values. And they kind of went, oh, well, they're good values, aren't they? We embodied them anyway, so we're going to go forward with them. And that's the troubling nature of that, is the fact that sometimes we're not able to understand our own kin as Unitarians. They're not Unitarians, but they're embodying the values. They're facing into the world with the values. And to me, I'm sort of thinking, well, that's what's really important. Isn't that what's really important? But they've also been incredibly good, and I think this is very important for us. They made me thinker in residence. But they've been very, very good. For instance, I'll give you a couple of examples and things that I'm also thinking practically here, things we can connect on. So they have a project called DIY. And basically they ask anybody to come and suggest a do-it-yourself project, and they've got funding for it as well, and they can often get collaborative funding for it too, in a very small amounts of money. But you could suggest something. So I'm thinking maybe to do a project on blessing. So you can just put that forward for a couple of days and say, well, who would like to come and do that as a kind of embodied performance project? Sarah Zoltash, who's Iranian Muslim background, did one again on embodying Muslim prayer. But she did it under the auspices of the Live Art Development Agency. She had loads of people, and it really, you know, it was like a 3-day project. And it kind of feels to me that those projects, great, they go out into the world then, and they kind of act like a little engine. And they are, so there are different kinds of events. And then they've got one that I'm looking at now where they have said, okay, perhaps our mission here is to re-energize what a church space might be. So we're going to ask anybody who considers themselves to be an artist, but it could be anybody, to create a commission for the space. And so now we've got 21 applications for what they might do in the space. That I don't know what they are actually, but they could be, we're going to connect gardens across the area. One of the things that somebody did was, another artist in performance, they went foraging with all the trees around the area, and then they brought all that back and they made jam in the community. And I'm interested in that,
practical connotation. It's spending your weekend going to Home Depot and learning how to replace your sink and doing it over the weekend as a project. And so it's like this really practical, down to earth kind of connotation to it. And so to bring that into the spiritual, that there can be something concrete that you can do within a certain time period and make things better.
But you can also just say it's spiritual, can't you? I mean, that's the other interesting. You can say we're going to, it's not really something, but you know, we're going to do plumbing for the weekend. But if you do it with an art and a spiritual context, then you're going to weave it through with that. So I'm thinking those are interesting things. Anyway.
No, it's on the same topic. I was reading, you know, something flashed by my phone. I was like not paying attention. But this article used the language of the right to repair movement, which I'll be honest, maybe I'm just under a rock. I know the DIY movement. I know the idea. There are lots of things, right? Women can use power tools, like the Bay Area loves to empower you to do. But this article was the right to repair movement, meaning we're allowed on some level, is threatening manufacturing companies. And I thought,
obsolescence.
But this to me is where it becomes absolutely spiritual, right? We are replacing the values of capitalism with some kind of self-sustaining, resilient, like ability, empowerment. That to me feels very spiritual.
I keep taking my vacuum cleaner apart.
Yes, that's
and
can you see yourself preaching about that as what it means to embody our values in a different way?
Which this brings me back to also valuing stories, like, you know, coming from where I grew up from, that was normal.
Yes.
Because there was no other way.
Right.
And it was deeply embedded in the history of my family. So how to do it also in a way that brings back these stories, that it's not some young hipsters that invented it, but is actually what some communities have always done, and that's their source of resistance. They know how to do it. And instead of being ashamed of that, it should become at the center of our, you know, our tools for resistance.
I think it's a New England Yankee value too, the frugality and, using up and making do and keeping.
But I mean, poor communities have done
Yeah.
that. I mean, you are supposed to be able to fix things 1,000 times. You bought a pair of shoes, it was supposed to do
Yeah.
for years. And you didn't need many, you just needed that one that will last. But, yeah.
And also generational memory. Like my grandmother, of course, was born just before the Depression, and so like we would kind of make fun of her. But like, why she still has these styrofoam coolers that are taped together to hold together? Because you save everything and you repair everything. That's what you do. You can't just go outside and that thing.
My Greek ex-mother-in-law cuts up washing up gloves and uses them for, elastic bands that you put around your Tupperware. Of course, you do that. But to think about it, there's a sense of somebody here was saying, there's a hipster sense in which is a kind of affectation. It's decorative affectation, actually. But there's another sense in which, what does it mean? Going back to my question about the more.
Yeah.
What does it mean to actually try to access the excess that's already present there? So for poverty-stricken, communities that have to, that would do it because that's what you have to do. You have to take things together. But to access the more and to understand the politics of that, I think is actually very, very profound. Because otherwise, as Sophia was saying, the kind of urgency that we're often, there is a we that is suggesting, I'm trying to live with less plastic, but there's a sense in which spiritually to try to really understand that and then to try to deal with it in a genuinely reparative way is work, isn't it? That's labor to get to that point. It's not obvious.
And what if we thought about it as ancestor centering, as Gabrielle was saying, rather than what people had to do because they were poor? Perhaps they knew better, right? Like we keep leaving capitalism in the middle as the logical way. Like if only the earth weren't dying, this would be the perfect value set. But I think almost every ancestral pot of knowledge would say, you have been deluded. Right? And so to recenter, I think calls us to something else.
Yeah, we should. Recenter and decenter, isn't it? Too, to decenter a certain kind of individualism
And whiteness.
and whiteness as a decentering. Yeah, is that a tool? Yeah.
May I ask, it's something, I have a question that will connect, I mean, it's for you, but it's also for everybody. Which is, this topic about the more. And how we need, in all we do, to leave the space for this more, because then we learn. And there's something sometimes that I see in the culture of white supremacy, and it's so embedded for me in how I, as an insider, outsider to Unitarian Universal, here, is that this mania of controlling, the delusion of controlling everything, so that the more will not happen. Yes.
Yeah.
Because, okay, good. I really smell it. I feel it. It's very crazy. It's asphyxiating in a way. But yeah, it is, right? I don't understand. So it's about this delusion and also a reality in some ways of control. So everything needs to be so controlled in liturgy, in the classroom, in the polity, in the thing. Some people absolutely know what is the right way to do things. And therefore, there's no created or allowed for the space where different kind of knowledge is co-created organically, and that's the more, and that's the, also deep spiritual message. That's where God sometimes comes through exactly in that space. But so I love so much about that this thread in all of your work, and I see that for us is a real issue, and I see so much of sometimes with the anxiety of some of the white students. It needs to be that way. It has to be the West, because in my congregation we did it that way. Yeah, because that whatever there's this only way of doing things that, by the way, is shaped so much by white people, even if they are progressive, etc. That kills.
This is exactly what I said all weekend, over and over and over again. liberal leaning into liberation means moving yourself to the margin and allowing generations, right, communities impacted by generations of harm to be the starting point for new knowledge. And in worship, Bill Sinkford, we did a dialogue sermon. No, but he said something that I thought was really important. He said, the theology of relinquishment is a hard sell.
Yeah.
And I didn't really take that on in the like 3 minutes I had allotted to respond. But I wanted to say the theology of relinquishment isn't real, which I think he would agree with, actually. But that we have kind of, instead of saying, we need exactly what you said, we can find God in this co-created space of knowledge from all that we have silenced for generations. Instead, we're saying, you are making a virtue out of my giving up control and you're giving me nothing, nothing in return. And that to me is indicative of a parched and weary spirit, right? That has not been nourished by anything but theories of supremacy for way, way, way too long. And we talked about domination, like what it means to give up domination rather than, like control as a virtue is, I think, the #1 problem affecting US Unitarian Universalism.
It's so problematic with this. I'm thinking right now about really hearing and acknowledging messy, difficult, angry situations and what is happening in Europe and in Brexit, where you're just having in France right now, where you can't move on the roads every weekend because people who are right wing, left wing, coming from everywhere are disrupting the entire country. And there's now another movement you probably know, which is what's it called? The Foulard Rouge, the Red Sky.
Yeah, sorry.
The energy, the complex energy that is released when people really start to take to the streets is so difficult. And I find that very, very hard actually to imagine at the moment, because I'm watching it happen in Britain as well. The people don't always know what to do, I tell you. That's very important to say, they don't. They also, that's just it's a very strange time, isn't it? Yeah. Because we're living in a time of populism. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just raising that because that's a really, really difficult one. So, in other words, there's a more, I'm saying that unchecked viral uprising is one thing, and serious co-creative, not serious, no one would use this word, but messy, angry, but imbued with something.
I think we need both. I have a dear friend who does a lot of change work, and he says we need people who will swing a hammer until the door breaks down, and we need to not force them to like rest their hammer politely on the table of conversation, like that. We need people who would never, ever, ever be someone who rams a door down, but who is in accountable relationship that maybe does the next phase of it. I think we lose a lot of energy in, what is like the one way that change can be generative. And I think actually we need a lot of successive, interrelated, hopefully connected, right? That can conviviality be real about the multiple ways that push something so forceful, like ideologies that are just so pervasive that it's almost impossible to interrupt.
I don't think conviviality is the tool. I think that conviviality is the is the spiritual aspiration, not the thing, not the ground.
I don't think I needed this at all.
Do you know what I mean?
I think so.
That it's not, it's the tools, it's the thing to try to get to what it means to be human. So conviviality can't do anything, can't act.
But it
There's no
can
agency.
orient multiple groups that are working in multiple ways.
Yeah.
Right.
I just kind of share about it. I mean, this is such an important conversation, actually. I'm just, because the real issue as well is what happens to cultures and what happens to societies, and things are breaking down very much in multiple places. I'm just thinking about Brazil today, or what's happening in Congo, or what's happening in Sudan. Yemen.
I was thinking, like, 2 years ago, I was asked to co-lead a process, a year-long process called Table to Action that gathered local spiritually grounded activists over the Bay Area. It was a project that started in New York City and was modeled in different cities and here. Gather these groups, activist groups, to have regularly dinner together. So in that sense, it was like a strategic moment of anti-oppressive, a conviviality set with some anti-oppressive ground rules, so that some connection could be made and some new thinking and tools could be developed. So without, so like an imperfect space created to allow for connections that were not happening outside, for people that actually were working around similar issues. So it could also be, in some ways, is that issue that, even at it's in the Venus Arcade, it's so much about that question. How do I hold the fact that because of injustice and historical injustice, we need to allow the voices that we silenced and pushed outside and those knowledge to be at the center. And at the same time, how do we hold the community together when, because exactly of the history we carry, it's so hard. But I have constantly conversation with the students that come and say, I didn't think, Esther King, this could happen. I didn't think we could have these fights. It's like, well, it is about this fight, actually. But it's so hard. But how to, at the same time, I'm also aware that if we faculty don't create a space where we can have these fights constructively, we implode.
Yes.
There's also the tendency of like, let's just destroy the whole school sometimes, because things are not perfect, and so that we constantly, I think, we live in that tension of like, we really have to have this conversation, we really have to say these things, we have to fight, and also how do we hold a space that is of community that has elements of what you call conviviality, that we can sit at the table acknowledging all this, historical reality of injustice that still affect the present in a way that doesn't just bring us to decide that we cannot be together at all, because there's no element of common trust. There is no element of common vision. There's just disintegration, which sometimes I wonder, sometimes I think maybe, if I listen carefully, what I'm hearing is that.
Oh, you say in the space as well, something about the acceptance, the value of being wrong and imperfect, and that we are called also to that space. It doesn't have to be tidy, good, right, or anything else, in order to allow, because the tidy house cannot possibly allow in the voices which refuse politeness or refuse to act in certain ways. And the more that, and the spiritual connection is trusting that can be done, and that there is a commons there, there's a commonality. And then this conversation just gets to, yes, this really is what it means. How to live next.
So I'm thinking about entropy.
Yeah.
Because right, it's this universal law from physics, and it flows through everything. And organizations and cultures and civilizations are subject to entropy as well. The
Yeah.
closed system will eventually break down. It'll deteriorate. So you want to open it up, right? You want the inputs. You want to decenter what has been framed by the boundaries. You want to bring it in, the new insight. But at the same time, an open system in a disorganized way, the energy that comes in just destroys it unless there's a proper way to channel it. So you can't just throw energy at it. And I think that's what you're speaking to in some of the dangers sometimes in mindfulness movements. It's just throwing energy at it in an uncoordinated or incoherent way, then it's going to fall apart even more. So the sun shines on my skin and I get a sunburn and I get cancer. The sun shines on the leaf and the leaf has photosynthesis to collect, store, move the energy, transform it into the system. So perhaps a few of the things we've talked about are how we can think creatively through how those allow us to have an open system that resists entropy through allowing expression through the arts, through the ways that covenants are expressed as aspirational, as invitational. To speak directly to the more, I know in Congregationalism, going to Baptist, a lot of times covenants were written in such a way as to give space for that more. Specifically, in a lot of Baptist covenants, to walk in all the ways that God has made known or will make known to us. So, in essence, always kind of leaving that space, like there's more to be reviewed. There's some humility. This is what we've known so far, but more yet to become. And so the reciting of the covenant with that more language, hopefully would create that space to allow for some innovation for the input and placed within the framework of shared values and commitments that pre-exist.
I find that a very painful thing to hear because of the millions of dead people, the thousands at the bottom of the ocean.
Right.
And photosynthesis and sunburn are not. I need to have acknowledgement of the pain and the tragedies and the ancestors and coming together covenantally, convivially, in any way without dealing with the trail of blood that comes with us and with every word we speak and every place we stand. There has to be some kind of, has to be acknowledgement of that. And the more includes that. It has to include the agony that we've caused ourselves and are causing ourselves. And so that I see that in the classroom here when what you're saying about things should be done and the trauma that many of our, sometimes as a Jew, I have a clear sense that on my shoulders there is not this blood that many of our students are bringing with them as they come to study here and look at restitution and look at the more. And so I can observe it and the pain that is brought here by these blessed people. I just finished teaching a class in which this all came up. Yeah, and we don't have the space here to this in this small little microcosm. We are trying, but I don't think we're doing very well with that. About the transformative work that needs to happen, the trauma work, the ancestry work, the somatic work.
With learning, I mean, we're learning to do it, and we have to learn so much more. And at the same time, some of us studied when this conversation were not even happening, and it wasn't ages ago.
Yes.
So how like the fact that we need to retrain ourselves because some of this stuff
Yes.
we don't know. I mean, we had glimpses, so we learn by negative experience and some positive teaching, but it's something, I mean, it's the center of what we want to do. I also wanted to, every time I hear about, I know the people underwater. I mean, this is not the ancestors. Well, they're not just in the past. These people that die by the hundreds and thousands every day are in the present.
Yes.
It's constant, and it's not. And being in the U.S., white or Jewish, you're also related to that. We are all constantly related in different ways to different histories about the past, about what the reality about today, and that is always there. And at the same time, I think one part of that, like the hope, is also the conviviality can be so many things according to what we understand. It's when I see what is happening is all these small pockets where people reach out about these great differences. And so we were speaking about Lampedusa, for instance, where like one of the biggest port of entries were the people that escape on boats from North Africa and arrive in Sicily. Now they are mostly blocked, they cannot land in most places in Italy, but by the government decree. But like when actually these human connections happen outside the institution, sometimes in spiritual places, these are the places of hope. I mean, the people that entire villages that there are these horrible stories about how Italy, for instance, is turning so fascist and just horrible. And I have to reground also myself to also bring to my mind all the other stories that I read about the amazing connections that happen and people just showing up and say, this is my kin and I'm going to give up everything, break the law, give my stuff, share my living space, give my clothes to these people that are writing because that's the only right thing to do. And that is also true, and so to keep that,
I think I also want us to really pay attention to how even in this conversation, it is so easy to get sucked back into this notion that politeness is actually the best thing. That if it's outside of politeness, then it is the wrong way to do the thing. When that cultural dominance has killed people for generations. And I am acculturated to that myself. I am, right? I'm a product of so much education, with a particular class perspective, a whole bunch of things. But honestly, like, if our congregational covenants like leave a little bit of room for a new voice, but don't say at all, this is how we have used dominance to silence those voices anyway, it's not useful to me. And I want people disrupting traffic in the streets. It is horrifying to me that our federal employees went unpaid for more than a month and there was nothing like disruption in the streets. Like, we are so shackled by white supremacy manifested as politeness, efficiency, a particular kind of articulateness. We let people die around us before changing that cultural norm. And then worse, I think we get into the space where students in the school are trying to take on what it means to disrupt these things, but without enough of the realization, right, of entitlement or collusion. And so then we take this idea of disrupting the system, right, to manifest our own privilege rather than to actually create justice. And the thing I'm so excited that you said, like, can we please retrain ourselves as a faculty? We have to. We have to, because we're sending people out into spaces that are nothing like Star King, thinking that pushing against Star King is going to prepare them for pushing against systems of oppression. And then the number of students that like graduate and then hit an internship and then say, whoa, I'm never going to be a minister, is starting to trouble me.
There are so many things coming into the space. I mean, I love that
sense. I use that word generously as well, love. Do you think that love brings into that space all of these different kinds of messy, wrong, as well, to speak from the space of wrong, something I'm kind of getting more interested in, that have to be right. I don't know. But so much is coming into that space, and I just want to kind of, because I think we have to start to close actually, I'm going to bring it up a little bit and say that the sense of what we can do practically has started to feel to me, and always has been, that on the small scale, it's very important as well to mark our path all the time through actually joyful encounter, spiritual encounter, and things that can be done. Like I was telling you about that small project, and connection. So I'm partly here as well, and Sofia and Devorah are kind of my poster women as well for this, about that connection doesn't have a necessary outcome, but things happen afterwards. So they both came towards it. And what I'm really here for is just to think of how to live next, is about continuing that journey and understanding what we bring along the way. I feel immensely privileged to be part of this conversation here today, actually, in its big sense. We're living together, thinking about what these things really mean, what they really call us to, rather than, yes, we want them to sit here and isn't it great to have some people somewhere else, and gosh, but that they are really important. And I think that notion of, and not anti-politeness, but that what is also beyond as well as what's more, really important. Is beyond the discourse that we find acceptable, that we have to listen to urgently. So I think really important. Am I called to close the session?
No, we can. We can. That feels very big. We can close it by thanking you, and also say that there could be more conversation because, for instance, I have all these things.
We can also move to the table.
We have brought some food and for some
That
of
would
us
be
to
lovely.
have lunch together.
Yeah.
We can continue
If you're
the conversation in different ways. But I just wanted to thank you for the speech today and for being, willing to have this kind of really engaged conversation with us, where we brought so much of our own questions and our own context, but also for having that spark of intuition already, like when was it 3 or 4 years ago, that made you say we have to develop, recreate these connections. That's something we don't know exactly what, but that there's value in this connection and these exchanges, and this something this could be a place where more in a life-giving, justice-giving sense can be created. So I'm very thankful that you initiated it, you keep working on it and visiting us and giving us this, by pushing the both at home with your own institutions, but also showing up physically yourself. Even when it's hard to take the time, it's a gift to us. And so I welcome the continuation of the relationship and the dialogues that it generates. So,
well, thank you. I think nourishment comes in different forms, and I think this has been very nourishing in bringing together many different kinds of, or bringing into this space many different kinds of things that are really relevant to what may happen next. And we're not in control of that, but I trust and have faith that what is going to happen next will also be important, small, big, whatever it is. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Sarah and Georgia.
Thank you.
One thing that I did want to say is that unless we think about different contexts, even the question of politeness, it has to be contextual, because, for instance, I was trying to be unpolite, right? Because my background, disruptive, interruptive. But what is happening in Europe is in some ways we are dealing with the question of politeness is now not politeness, but just the basic of civil exchange is again, it's not put in question by the rise of fascism and Nazi ideology, where I think that comes from some of the background, that I think, with some of the conversation that we are having in Europe about it's not about pushing out the people that never had, ability to be in the conversation like it is in the United States. But it's the question that we're having is how do we, politely or unpolitely push back the people that are assaulting the Jews again, physically beating up migrants of color, non-Latin coming into the polling. The atrocity that I read every single day, what happens in Europe, and the fact that the politicians now in charge embrace them and foster them, brings back, the question about, well, that's not what we do. But so I see so much like here, coming to the United States, there was so much the culture of the pretense that the state is civil, when it's a state that is built on genocide and slavery. And every concept of civility and politeness is based on the cover up of all of that. And so I see that, it's so important to always see the connection, but also see how discourses functions in different contexts, in specific moments in history, slightly different because of what we are dealing with. So I feel like we have to be maybe training our students to know when maybe a deeper embodied understanding of when to be disruptive and unpolite, and when actually instead the ability to sit down with people across some ideological divide and having even a dinner conversation is so important. And so it's just like one or the other, but one is more constructive, like giving, justice, bringing to do this versus that. And how can I have the range in me as a leader in the community and politically in a group to know how to do all of that and say, this is always wrong and this is always right. But this is the context where I have to call for, basic human decency that helps us not to beat up the most oppressed. And when it's again, in the moment when we have to disrupt the law and bring the street because we need to bring up these issues. And so many of the people that march in the streets now in Europe are the right wing. So it doesn't give me any comfort.
No, I do. They're not marching, they're just out there. But it's kind of the conversation to me here also just really suggests very strongly what's at stake in thinking about spiritual communities and the importance of religious connectedness. It's really, really, really absolutely crucial where we are. And I think of Abraham Joshua Heschel's words about, not everyone is guilty, but all are responsible. That just seemed to me for such a long time to be the kind of sentence on also calls for deep thought. But anyway, sorry, that's continuing. Thank you. I was just going on again in my own voice. Thank you. Practical connection as well. That could be our next move. Just feel.